welcome, Michael, to Method Ministry, or I should say, Dr. Michael Shultz. Welcome to Method Ministries. Thanks for being here with us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a real honor.
Yeah, my pleasure. I want to go ahead and introduce yourself so our audience can know who you are and what you do.
Yeah. So my name is Michael Shultz. I'm the senior pastor of Antioch Baptist Church in Lewisburg, Kentucky, and I'm also an associate professor of church history at Forge Theological Seminary in South Carolina. I've been in the ministry now 16 years,
Wow.
and I've been in the pastorate for about 12. So it's been a long-term commitment, even though I'm not very far in. I imagine with any luck or with the grace of God, I'll have a ministry like John MacArthur one of these days where it's 50, 60 years in, but God's been really great.
Awesome. So, as I was telling you before too, just to let my audience know, I found Dr. Michael Shultz on a conference on YouTube, Eschatology That Matters. And they were talking about all the millennial views. And, I feel like that he just like totally crushed historic premillennialism and just like blew them all out of the water. And I just really, enjoyed, also too, like, how you went through the whole system. You cracked a lot of jokes. You got me laughing. So, I believe like you do just like an awesome, like one of the best presentations on premillennialism that I heard. So great job.
I appreciate that. Yeah, and it's a view that needs to be presented more often, because part of that speech was, or a big part of it was me listing off just name after name of historical Christians and scholars and theologians that have held to the historic premill view. But when you ask somebody about historic premillennialism, a lot of the time they've never heard of it. They have no idea that it's an option. They've only ever heard of dispensationalism. And for the most part, people's experience with dispensationalism is either really positive or really negative. And so they have very strong feelings about it. So I was glad to be able to present it, and glad that it had that kind of effect on you.
Yeah, definitely. By the way, for my audience, we are experiencing some Wi-Fi problems, so just hang in there. But the content's going to be great on this. But just talk about that real quick. A lot of people, they think when they hear about premillennialism, they automatically go to dispensationalism, and I even find that with people who critique premillennialism, it's never just premillennialism. It's always, let me just go after dispensationalism. And like you said, like people don't know that premillennialism has an historic attached to it. And, especially, like big, long tradition going all the way back to, the early, one of the earliest days, close connection to the first century Christians, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But, that's the interesting side about this, because like that name historic is attached to premillennialism, and that's not without, that has significance attached to it. And you kind of mentioned that too, like in your introduction, like it's so old. It's what the apostles believed, it's what the apostles taught.
Right. Yeah, and it is, you've got guys like Polycarp and Papias who are known for writing about this, and it's really the thorn in the side of all of the other millennialistic views, because if you go back, there's just no disputing it. The earliest disciples did believe this. You can read the early church documents like the Didache or others like it, and you're going to realize unavoidably this is what they believed. Now, that's not a nail in the coffin kind of argument, because there are guys, early guys, that believe some really wacky stuff. One of the big examples of this is Origen. If you read much of anything written by Origen, he really believes some weird stuff, including like reincarnation. He believed in this system where you rose and fell in this reincarnate kind of system. And that's entirely wackadoo. Like Christians would say, you're not even a Christian if you believe that. But nevertheless, the fact that when we're talking about eschatology, particularly, this view is the view of the early church, hardly anybody argues against that. I think it was Justin Martyr who made the comment that there were people that did not believe that in the early church, but by and large, it's the dominant view of the early church, and that's not a coincidence. These guys were discipled by the apostles, and they just so happened to believe this way. That's not a coincidence.
Yeah. Well, that being said, can you give us the case for historic premillennialism?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different cases. So I would consider that aspect of it the historical argument. Just precisely that the early church, those that carried on the teachings of the early apostles, believed this. They specifically taught this doctrine, and so you could consider that as uh, appropriate evidence that this is what the apostles taught them. And if this is what the apostles taught them, and the apostles were the ones that wrote the books of the Bible that we're trying to understand, we would at least assume they understood what they were writing. And so if this is what they understood it to mean, that's probably what it meant. That's, again, not a rock solid argument, because John could have interpreted his writings wrong. John was not infallible. The writings that he produced were infallible. John could have read it and misunderstood it himself. That's possible. So could Luke and Paul and James and all the rest. They could have misunderstood their own writings. That's possible, but it's, in my mind, at least unlikely. The biblical argument itself, just inside the scriptures, is fairly straightforward. If you read the book of Revelation straight through, you see no secret rapture. It is not there. The argument for a secret rapture in the book of Revelation has to be read between the lines. Somewhere between chapters 3 and 4, you have to assume that the rapture has happened without it ever being explicitly stated. So we would say, well, you can't do that. Then you go on through and you see the world in no small way going to hell. And we would look at the postmillennialist and say, well, okay, this is not what you're saying is going to happen. Things are really going badly. Then you get to chapter 19 and you have Christ returning. And up to that point, a historic premillennialist and a non-millennialist can pretty much agree. We can hold hands and walk all the way from Revelation 1 through Revelation 19. But when we get to the end of Revelation 19, there's a transition to Revelation 20, which is, it's been called one of the most unfortunate breaks in the text ever made. Because if the break in Revelation 19 and 20 was not recognized by that chapter break, and you read it straight through as one continual story, you wouldn't have any obvious indicator that the story had changed. And it seems as though Christ comes back and then begins a period in which he reigns on the earth. After that, Satan is loosed, and the world comes to an end at his destruction, the new heavens and the new earth, and we're in the eternal state. Again, at no point do you see a secret rapture. You don't see 7 judgments or a number of judgments. You see only one judgment. You don't see the world getting better. You see it getting worse. You see a physical resurrection of the saints, a first resurrection who live on the earth with Christ. Consider it 1,000 years or not, that period happens. And then you see this second resurrection of the unjust and the destruction of Satan having been loosed at the end of time. Those things, I think, if you read them straight through, will lead you to historic premillennialism. And I've said this before, kind of in joking. I believe honestly that if we burned all of our eschatological materials, if we burned everything that we'd ever written on eschatology, and we refused to teach our children any eschatological view, we left them just the Bible, and we died like the first generation of Israelites coming out of Egypt, and just left them to walk into this new era and develop their own eschatology based just on the Bible, I believe the entirety of the next generation would be historic premill, because you have to be taught to be amill. You have to be taught to be postmill. You have to be taught to be dispi. I firmly believe if you just gave somebody a Bible and asked them what's going to happen in the end, they would describe historic premillennialism.
So what would you say to people though who will throw out the objection though that Revelation is a book of apocalyptic literature, where they would want to come in and just kind of like shoo all that away? So then when you do get to chapter 19, do get to chapter 20, they say, yeah, but that's all symbolic and that's not literal. Therefore, postmillennialism, therefore amillennialism.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'm willing to agree with a lot of that. I'm not a strict literalist. I certainly wouldn't believe in, this literalism that requires that the locusts represent, Black Hawk helicopters and all the ridiculous examples. There are some that you take them literally and it comes off a lot more understandable. But on that trend, I would respond to somebody that says that, okay, there are clearly some things that are symbolic and some things that are literal. Okay. And there are some things that are actually going to happen and they're depicted in symbolic ways, but they still occur. So for example, we believe in a new heavens and a new earth that will come about. And an amillennialist and a postmillennialist and a dispy and a historic premill, they'll all agree there will be a new heaven and a new earth. Okay.
Yep.
It's depicted as having streets of gold that are transparent like glass and gates of pearl and walls of all these different types of gems. It's probably not, it's not likely that it will literally have streets made of gold and gates made of pearl and walls made of gems. So you say, well, but will there actually be a new heavens and a new earth? Yes, that will literally occur. The way it's depicted may be symbolic, but it will literally occur. Jesus comes back. Jesus comes back. We all believe he's going to come back, all mill, post mill, pre-mill alike. We all believe he's coming back. He's depicted as coming back riding a horse. Is he literally going to be riding a horse? Probably not. I would doubt it. Okay, so you have Jesus coming back. That's literally going to happen. The way it's depicted may be different, but it's literally going to happen. Then you have the new heaven and the new earth. It's literally going to happen. The way it's depicted may be different, but it's literally going to happen. That's Revelation 19 and Revelation 21. Well, the one right in between them is the millennial reign, the 1,000 years. Is that literally going to happen? Yes. The way it's depicted may include symbols and things, but you don't get to say it's not literally going to happen unless you're willing to hold that Jesus doesn't literally come back and there's not literally a new heavens and new earth. You have to hold a consistent view of these things. So even if we're going to say some things are symbolic, and I'm willing to admit that, yeah, some things are symbolic, but you don't get to say that everything is symbolic, especially when you're cramming it in based purely on your presuppositions. The events themselves have to be, at least in some sense, literal, or else we've thrown the meaning of the text entirely away because of what we want it to say. So for that person, I would say, have fun with your symbolism and go through your numerology and figure out what it could possibly represent, but you don't get to say it's not going to happen. You can't explain it away that way.
And that's with what, like, a lot of things too, because even like the Bible uses imagery, like language just naturally uses metaphors and symbolism. Like the Bible calls us we're the sheep of Christ. Christ is our shepherd. Yes, those are symbolism, but there's still a reality here. And I feel like a lot of people will automatically try to downplay that only when it comes to Revelation. Like they're fine using symbolism, numerology, or typology, the whole 9 yards over here. But when it gets down to specifically the book of Revelation, because they're a post mill, because they're an on mill, then it's like, oh, well, there's numerology, there's typology, there's all this, and I can't understand it. But it's like, well, if you take that approach, what can you understand in the Bible? And the answer would be consistently nothing. I think.
Yeah, I actually just finished. We will be finishing this month a study through the book of Revelation. I've taught on Sunday nights at our church, one chapter at a time, all the way through. And one of the things that I have consistently driven forward is God did not give us this book for us to not understand it. He has given us this book for us to understand. He didn't write us some mysterious letter that he knew we were never going to understand, so that when the end came, he could say, oh yeah, that's what it meant. And we'd all go, oh, wow. That would be meaningless for us. It'd be worthless, So we need to get out of this mindset where everything eschatological or apocalyptic is ethereal and not able to be understood. And we need to break this down and say, no, there's a meaning here, and it has to be something that we can grasp. And I would argue it needs to be something that makes a difference. Because if you just say, well, this is a big argument going on with full preterists. This is something that happened 2,000 years ago, and it bears almost no weight other than a lesson to be learned on our lives today. I say that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. The idea that God would give us this book and it be the last book written in the canon, and the canon's closed with this one, and we believe that it's prophetic, but then to say, well, it's really no impact on us today. That's insane. So yeah, this is meant to be understood, and it's meant to have an impact on our lives.
You talked about in your or at the conference, when you talk about historic premill, you made a really solid argument for why chapter 19 and 20 of Revelation is one vision, instead of just how the everybody else but the premill just separates the two. Can you walk us through, because I think that's a really solid argument. And you quoted Anthony Hoekema, who says, like, if Revelation 19 and 20 is one vision, we're virtually compelled to accept premillennialism, which is, tells you everything you need to know. So it's like, for them, they absolutely need to separate these two chapters. So can you walk us through the argument that you gave of chapter 19 and 20 being one vision and one story?
Yeah, and I haven't actually rehearsed that speech in recent time or listened to it, but
No,
I'll
it's
try to
okay.
give you briefly what I remember the argument to have been. Yeah, so if you're going to break a section of Revelation from a different section, you'd need a reason to do so. Generally, there are three good ways of knowing, okay, I can break this section off as something different. The first would be a new vision has occurred. The second would be that there's a narrative shift, and the third would be linguistic change. So if there's a new vision, what that means is that in the book of Revelation, John actually has at least 4 different visions. He has one in chapter 1, another one, I believe, in chapter 4, another one in chapter 17, and another one in chapter 21. And those are always marked out. But any time that he delineates a new vision, it's pretty clear. That definitely does not happen between chapters 19 and 20 at all. There's no new vision. A narrative shift would be if the story radically changes. So the characters that you were just talking about are no longer present. The setting is different. The events that are going on don't make any sense to be in continuation with the previous events. That doesn't happen between Revelation 19 and 20. In fact, Revelation 19 seems to involve Jesus coming to the earth and dealing with his enemies. Revelation 20 explicitly opens with this kingdom being developed on the earth and his final enemy being incarcerated. And the incarceration even deals with the same characters. Revelation 19 deals with the beast and the false prophet, which would be 2 members of what we might call the unholy trinity. And Revelation 20 opens with the incarceration of Satan himself. So that continuation seems to be pretty clear as far as the characters in the story and the setting, as well as the events that are going on. Finally, you're left with a linguistic change. And what that would be is the language that's used just literally tells you we're somewhere different now. So this would be something like when John says, and I was taken to a high mountain or something. It could be indicated that some sort of a shift in the scene has taken place. He's somewhere new, or he just in the language indicates to you, this has changed. And that does not happen between Revelation 19 and 20. From Revelation 19:11 forward, he starts using this Greek phrase kai eidon, which is translated in English usually as "and I saw" or "then I saw." In Revelation 19, that goes all the way from Revelation 19:11 forward, and it's the very first phrase that's used in Revelation 20 verse 1, and then it's used again, I believe, in verses 4 and 7. And so if you hold that Revelation 20 is one continual story, and you hold that Revelation 19:11 through the end of the chapter is one continual story, you don't have any reason at all to believe that there's a break between Revelation 19 and 20 based on any standard. There's no new vision, there's no narrative shift, there's no linguistic shift. It's one continual story, which brings us to the point that you mentioned about Anthony Hoekema, who was the amillennialist scholar. He says if it's one continual story, we have to be premill. And he's right. You have to.
Yeah.
But they do insert this break there. And I was actually very interested. The fella Micah Gerhart, who defended amillennialism at the conference you were talking about, he actually presented a view where Revelation 20, 1 through 10 is not one continual story. And he contended that "then I saw" or "and I saw" actually indicates a break in the story itself, which is not at all what I had ever heard an amillennialist defend. G.K. Beale would entirely disagree with that thesis, but that's what he put forward. That's more consistent. You would have to hold something like that. If you're going to break 19 and 20, you'd have to then break up 20, 1 through 3, 4 through 7, and 7 through 10 as totally different stories, not necessarily connected to each other. But then you get off in the weeds in a way that I couldn't possibly defend.
Because even like following after the 1,000-year reign, like you have the great white throne judgment that as you mentioned, you have the new creation. So I don't understand how how they can say, okay, it breaks between chapter 19 and 20, but then 20 keeps going on consistently. Where it's like if the arguments for chapter 19 are there, the new vision, then why is it not a new vision for the great white throne judgment, the creation? And now it's like, okay, well, when do you place this? When is that? And like the whole thing just goes out the window, and it just breaks apart the text. Trying to handle the scripture that way, and I think it does
Right.
a great injustice. Like they don't do that for anything else but those two chapters, and then they argue. They have their arguments for that more so, but contextually, there's as you said, there's no biblical justification for this.
Right. I've even heard some, like you said, they take chapter 20 forward and say that that's all sequential. That's actually not always the case. A lot of people will say that chapter 21 is a recapitulation of chapter 20, and that the new heavens and the new earth is actually what we live on in the millennial kingdom. And then if you extrapolate that back to an amillennialist framework where they're saying we currently live in the millennium, then we would be currently living in the new heaven and the new earth. They wouldn't argue that as much, but a post-millennialist might, where they would say we're going to continue to evolve in this way towards the kingdom, and when we actualize it, then we'll be in the millennium, if you want to call it that. But I've heard it argued that Revelation 21, which is the new heavens and the new earth, is a recapitulation of Revelation 20 in the millennial kingdom. And honestly, that's a big view of new creation millennialism, which is something that people keep accusing me of endorsing, but I don't. I'm firmly historic premill, but that view does hold. They're essentially premill, but they hold that the millennial kingdom occurs on the new heavens and the new earth, and that Revelation 21 is a recapitulation. So that's something that is growing. It's very odd. And like you're saying, there's hardly any justification for it. If you're just reading the text, you'd have to be taught to believe that.
Yeah, definitely. Would you agree with this? Because I was recently reading George Eldon Ladd commentary on this, and he he has the belief that the 1,000 years could be more or a different time period than the number 1,000. So that got me thinking. I don't hold that view, but from an historic pre-mill, or I guess George L. Laddam point of view, is would you first still interpret the 1,000 years as literal, or do you think that could be any number of time?
My first impulse is to take it literally. And that's different because I'm comfortable with what Ladd does throughout the book of Revelation. He does take numbers to be symbolic. In fact, most historic premillennialists do. I just finished John Piper's new book, Come Lord Jesus, and he makes a point of claiming that most of the numbers in Revelation are symbolic. So 3.5 years, time, half times, 42 months. They only receive their power for an hour or so. I think that's in chapter 17 or 18, somewhere in there. Those markers of time can be very much symbolic. My impulse is to take the 1,000 years literally, because I think he uses it 7 times in
6.
those 10 verses. He says 1,000 years 7 times in as many verses. And it seems like he's trying to drive that point home. But like you've read, George Eldon Ladd can make a good point in interpreting it figuratively or symbolically, where it represents just a totality of time. So it would be, what is it, 10 by 10 to the 10th? It's something like that. He makes some argument about it representing just completion, and that's possible. I'm not offended by that view, but
guys, yes, they said we had some internet difficulties. So Dr. Michael Shultz, we cannot see him, but he's still here. And just to continue the conversation, one of the things that I think that people who are post millennials and amillennials don't realize is, even if the number 1,000 isn't literal, and I think this is a really important point, you would still have because of the placement coming after the second coming of Christ, there's still going to be a literal fulfillment of that on the earth, and that only happens after he returns. So really, I think much of this debate comes down to, well, when does 1,000 years happen? Because even if you want to argue, oh, that's not actually 1,000 years, okay, well, you still have the problem of the placement. When does Christ come? Does Christ come before that? And when does that 1,000 year happen? Does it happen before he comes or after he comes? And if it comes, if that happens after he comes, if Revelation 19 is the second coming of Christ, and chapter 20 is following that, whether the 1,000 years is literal or not, you still have an actual little fulfillment on the earth happening, which defeats amill, just defeats post-mill.
Yeah, you've nailed it. That's really, it doesn't matter if the millennium, if you still want to call it that, it doesn't matter if the millennium is 1 day or 1,000 years. You're pre-mill if you hold that Revelation 19 comes before Revelation 20. That's the bottom line. It doesn't matter how long the millennium is. So yeah, you've nailed it. There's not a lot that I can add to that. You've just pretty well summed it up.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah. Next question I want to ask: how would you say this compares to dispensationalism pre-mill? Like, what are like some key differences here?
Yeah, well, it doesn't make a huge difference on your eschatology, but I do want to note that most historic premillennialists are not dispensational in the framework, not just in their eschatology. Most historic premillennialists would be covenantalists, and so they're not going to accept the idea that God operates differently in different dispensations. But that doesn't affect your eschatology tremendously. The big eschatological differences between a historic premillennialist and a dispensationalist would be the where is the church? That's going to be the big difference. So for a dispensationalist, by and large, they believe in a secret pre-tribulational rapture. Most all of them believe that it happens 7 years before the second coming of Christ, because they believe in a 7-year tribulation period fulfilling Daniel's 70th week. For a historic premillennialist, virtually none of that makes any sense. So most historic premillennialists believe something similar to idealism or historicism. It's kind of a combination there, where the words of Christ in the Olivet Discourse and the description of the end times through the book of Revelation are fulfilled through the course of history, starting with Pentecost, more or less, or even the resurrection of Christ. They don't, most historic premillennialists don't believe that that's all, though. That would be some form of preterism. Most historic premillennialists believe that there will ultimately be an end times event where ultimately things culminate to the worst they've ever been. There's a man of lawlessness that arises and proclaims himself to be God. So you can still call him the Antichrist if you want to. There's a falling away of the church and apostasy. And at that time, then Christ returns for his people. But they don't believe, historic premillennialists don't believe in a secret rapture. We believe that when Jesus comes back to rapture the church, everyone will see it. Whether they are saved or not, everyone will see him come. We don't believe in a rapture that's prior to his coming. We believe that it's one event. So he raptures up the church and he comes to bring judgment on the earth at the same time. We don't necessarily believe in a 7-year tribulation period, although there are some that probably do. We would believe more that the tribulation period is the expanse of time between the first coming of Christ and the second coming of Christ. And so at this point, nearly 2,000 years. But it culminates at the end with this ultimate, what we might call the Great Tribulation, this time of really, really bad sorrows that the world has never seen before. Aside from just what happens before the second coming, a dispensationalist and a historic premillennialist will get along with everything after the second coming, with the exception of my view on who goes into the millennial kingdom, what's the purpose of the millennial kingdom, and all of that. The fact that there's a reign of Christ on the earth after his second coming, and then the great white throne judgment, and then the eternal state. Any premillennialist will be able to get along with that. But my view is a little weird when it comes to those things.
The first question I have for you is: do you hold to a 7-year tribulation? Like, do you put a gap between the 69 and 70th week of Daniel?
Man, I really need to hammer that out for myself. I
Okay.
have not come down hard on that yet. Like I said, we just finished, or we're in chapter 21 this week of Revelation, teaching it to my church this year, and I definitely believe that there is coming time of hardship and birth pains and sorrows unlike anything the world has ever seen. But I have not put the time into landing myself firmly on whether it's 7 years long, whether Daniel's 70th week is in reference to that or not. So I've not figured that out for myself yet. I was raised in that, and so there's part of me that feels emotionally tied to it. But
yeah, so it sounds like you're still trying to work out like how long the 7-year tribulation is. Like you haven't landed yet.
yeah, right. And I'm fine with people that believe it's 7 years long. Just in reading, and this is on my head fresh, John Piper in this new book, Come Lord Jesus, he talks about how that he believes you can't possibly hold that the second coming is more than 5 years out. And so he pretty firmly comes down and says, no, it's not 7 years. And I don't know. I would have to. He has one footnote in the book that addresses Daniel's 70th week, but that's it. And so I would love to know why he's so firm on the fact that it absolutely cannot be 7 years long. But no, I've not made up my mind for myself on that one yet. I need to do another study of Daniel, but
Gotcha.
Haven't spent the time yet.
I do hold that it is 7 years, and I think good key indicator is in Revelation 13, where it says that the Antichrist kingdom is going to reign for 3.5 years. So it's like, well, 3.5 years. Well, what's the other half? 3.5 years, 3.5, or it says 42 months, which
Right.
coincides perfectly with 7 years. And then, I do posit as, week difference.
Right.
But just asking another question too is, you mentioned how in, disagreeing with dispensationalism, in chapter 20 of Who Enters the Millennial Kingdom, because I heard you mention this too, you believe there is only resurrected, glorified bodies of believers. There's no unbelievers or unresurrected bodies that enter the millennial kingdom. Was that? Do you still hold to that?
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, and then you also interpreted, because the question then is, well, who does Satan deceive at the end of the millennial? And I think you also said too that those are the people those are the unbelievers who get resurrected, and they try to fight for Satan and overcome Jesus.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. What's the because I never heard that view before. What's the because I'm trying to place the resurrection happens in the great white throne judgment. So like where does the resurrection of the unbelievers happen? Does that happen, would you say, then, according to this view, when Satan is released from prison, the other people are released with him?
Yeah. So just briefly pulling this up here, Revelation 20, verse 5. It just says, the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. And so that's a precursor. That's a little bit of foreshadowing. The only other time he says that something is going to happen when the 1,000 years are over is in verse 3, when he says, Satan is thrown into the pit. It's shut and sealed over him so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. Then he must be released for a little while. So we wouldn't hold that Satan is released at the great white throne judgment. He's released when the 1,000 years are over. In the same way, when it says in verse 5, the second resurrection occurs when the 1,000 years are over, well, we don't have any reason to believe that that's a different time than what he refers to in verse 3. So John actually sets it up as foreshadowing. There's a 1,000-year period where Christ is going to reign. Satan is bound. The unregenerate are not resurrected. But there are two events that occur when the 1,000 years are over. Number one, Satan is released. Number two, the unregenerate are resurrected. And so when those two things occur at the same time, and then we suddenly have this huge uprising where all of the, Satan at least, and a bunch of people following him are trying to wage war on Christ. I take that as it's not explicit, but I would take it as pretty clear. This is probably the people that are resurrected in the second resurrection. Now, the next question that comes up is, well, what in the world is the point of that? God raises them from the dead just to kill them again, then judge them, then send them to hell. It's kind of overkill, isn't it? And I think the point is that God, when we get to heaven, for example, whatever your conception of that is, whether you have a concept where heaven is as some ethereal spiritual thing, or the eternal state is something physical like a new heavens and the new earth or whatever. When we get there, we won't be safe because Satan is not there. We will not persist in perfection through all of eternity because nobody is there to tempt us. We will be safe because God is there. We will persist in perfection because we're in the presence of the one that we most want to emulate. So it's not the absence of Satan that keeps us safe. It's the presence of God. And I think the point of Revelation 20 with this resurrection of the unregenerate and the slaughter of them all at one time is for God to show us, even if the embodiment of evil in Satan himself and every single person who ever died or lived in an unregenerate way, every demon in hell, every lost person, and Satan himself, even if they all came at the same time and under one flag tried to wage war against me and my kingdom, I would still not be challenged. There would be nothing that could ever challenge your security. And so coming out of our world where we see this this lifetime as one where we have great insecurity because for an American at least we have the biggest military. We can be secure because our military is better than anybody else. But woe unto us if we ever stop funding the military. In heaven, it's not like that at all. It wouldn't matter if every enemy of God ever united and then at one time marched on him. It would still be absolutely no challenge to him whatsoever. So our security is not that Satan is gone. Our security is that God is present. So that in my conception, that's the purpose of doing that, is to show us your security is not in the absence of these people. Your security is in the presence of me.
Wow. What would you, going back to what we talked about in the beginning, because this is called historic premill. So, people, kind of try to argue here and there that maybe millennialism was a predominant belief. I heard some arguments that are just to me I think that's factually not true. But can you kind of walk us a little bit through briefly on the historicity of premillennialism? Like, did the early church, was this indeed the earliest form of the millennial view?
Yeah, I would be really shocked. I know there's a book out right now, Ragnius something another. There's a fellow, he's an amillennialist, and he wrote a book trying to argue that premillennialism was not, in fact, the earliest view of the church. And the arguments are simply cherry-picked. You're either looking for evidence that isn't there, or you're ignoring the evidence that is there. If you read the early documents, there's just no argument to be made. Polycarp is clearly premillennialist. Papias is clearly premillennialist. Clement of Rome is clearly premillennialist. Irenaeus is clearly premillennialist. Justin Martyr, clearly premillennialist. There's just no argument to be made. There's a really good book that nobody has ever read except me, apparently, by a guy named Robert Franklin, called Rediscovered Early Church Premillennialism. And it's a fantastic book. Let me actually see real quickly if this just crashes our entire world. Can you see me here?
No, I can't. Still blank screen. I can always include that
Oh, bummer.
in the description,
Well, I've got
though. But
yeah. So if it ever comes up, I'm actually holding it up here, but it's a book again, just called "Rediscovered Early Church Premillennialism." Here, just looking at a couple of pages, he's got entire sections on Papias, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Hippolytus, Tertullian, Victorinus, Lactantius, and it just goes through several of the early church fathers, and then he spends an entire chapter going through specifically what they believed. You would be interested in this because he has an entire chapter on what they believed regarding the 70th week of Daniel, what they regarded regarding the phrase times, and half a time, precursors to Christ's return from their perspective, birth pains to strike the world from their perspective, birth pains to strike the church. And so the book is very, very much worth reading. I don't think it's expensive. It's let me look here. I picked it up for $12. So
wow.
it's a very worthwhile
Yeah.
read and affordable text. Yeah. I'd highly recommend it to everybody because it's very accessible. You don't have to have a doctorate to read it, but it's just straightforward. To me, it's an open and shut case on that whole argument. There's just no argument to be had unless you're going to go through guys that are clearly premillennialist and try to find ways that they look post-mill or all-mill. There's just no argument to be made.
Yeah, and it's ironic too because a lot of people, especially the post-mill resurgence, they'll criticize dispensationalism all day long, and they'll say, oh, it's a new invention, when it's like, well, if we're going to just talk about the tradition, the historical argument, they're going to lose all day long, and even their views, even post-millennialism with these combinations of preterism now mixed into it, like that's entirely new as well. So it's like, as far as the historical weight or evidence goes, it's all day, every day, it's just going to go towards premillennialism, and I really feel like there's no way around it, honestly.
Right. Yeah, there's not. And people will get on to me because there's this thing in church history called the Münster Rebellion. It occurred in Eastern Germany a couple of centuries ago. And there were these guys that really believed that they were bringing in the millennial kingdom, that Münster, Germany was going to be the new city of Jerusalem. One guy that led the rebellion believed that he was the prophet Elijah, and they took over this city, murdered tons of people, ended up all being killed by Catholic soldiers. But one big thing that people like to point out is they say they were premillennialist. And so that's why they acted that way. And I've come back with what I think is fair, is they acted like postmillennialists. They developed this city where they were going to have a theonomic religious city that followed the laws of God and ushered in this millennial kingdom. That sounds more like postmillennialism to me. Of course, postmillennialism didn't exist back then. And so they'll say, well, no, they were pre-mill. That's why they went crazy. It's like, well, you wouldn't say that if it had worked. You would say that they were post-mill. And the same thing is going on with these people that look at the early church. They'll find some little thing and they'll say, oh, well, look at that. That's post-millennialism. Or they take this symbolically. That's amillennialism. But if something doesn't work, then they say, well, yeah, they were pre-mill. So if somebody says that in the millennial kingdom, we're going to indulge ourselves lustfully, and there's going to be grapes the size of watermelons that it takes 2 men to carry, and we'll get to do whatever we want and gorge ourselves gluttonously, then they'll say, oh, those premillennialists, they were crazy. That's why we don't believe that. But then when they talk about the kingdom of God on earth, then they want to say, oh, well, they're all-mill or they're post-mill. Like, no, come on. Give me a break.
What would you say to the post-mill, objection that this is very, pessimistic, and we're optimistic, and and even some amillennials, will adopt that language. Like some of them will make the distinction between how optimistic they are, what would you say about throwing that objection out to the premillennialists that you're pessimistic and we're optimistic?
So I tried briefly to address that in the conference speech, and the argument is at least that premillennialists believe we're going to lose, and that the Great Commission will not be successful, that Christ's church will ultimately fail, and that's not what premillennialists believe at all. Even dispensationalists don't believe that.
So true.
The argument is essentially based on a straw man, but the argument's out there anyway, and you do have to contend with it, even if you think it's a bad argument. The concept that premillennialists are pessimistic, I think, is dodging something that is not being addressed right now. A postmillennialist does believe we're going to win. They just believe it's going to be thousands of years until we do. In the meantime, we're going to continue losing a lot. And then at some point, we will have won something that will ultimately cross a border, and we will win a lot of times. But for the next several thousands of years, any postmillennialist will admit to you, we're probably still going to keep losing. So with gay marriage being legalized in America, that's a loss. Or with the loss of Northern Africa, that was once entirely Christian, now is entirely Muslim, that was a loss. And we can expect losses like that for thousands of years. But in the end, we'll win. Well, good grief, if that's optimistic and you're accusing us of being pessimists, what in the world is your definition? For an amillennialist, if you think that this is the way that I would honestly describe amillennialism, life is suffering, but then it ends. And that's the system. There's no climax of Christ comes and his kingdom is here and we get to reign. That never happens. Life, when I was in high school, I got in trouble one time, and I had to go to the principal's office, and the principal was really a disciplinarian, and he had me tell my side of the story, and he believed me, but he still had to punish me. And so he told me to write sentences or whatever. And as I was leaving, he goes, "Michael, there's something you need to remember in life." And he said, "You're serious, remember this." And he goes, "Life sucks, but then you die." And I thought that was the funniest thing in the world, because it was so just ominous. And for the amillennialists, that's pretty much the system. Is, well, life sucks, but then you die. The world stinks, history stinks, things don't get better, but then it's over. And then, oh, it's going to be great. And that's optimism? Really? Okay. So when you come to the premillennialist and we say, well, yeah, it's going to be really, really bad, and the world by and large is going to be taken by Satan, but the church is going to persevere, and the church is going to grow, and the Great Commission will be achieved. And when the gospel has been preached to all the corners of the earth, then the end will come. Christ is going, he has a number. If you're Reformed, you believe in a set number of people that Christ has atoned for. If you believe that, then any person will say, well, when that number is complete, there's no point in going on. So, and I know from an Arminianist standpoint, that may be a little different, but from a Reformed standpoint where I'm sitting, at least, that seems to be at least consistent. So there's no optimistic or pessimistic. There's just people who believe that in the end, Jesus wins, or people that don't. And if you don't believe Jesus wins, you're not even a Christian. Everybody has an optimistic eschatology if you believe the Bible. So that argument, it seems to be more of a bandwagon argument. Well, you don't want to believe premillennialism because it's a whole lot more fun to be post-mill. It's like, okay, well, if I was just going to make up an eschatology and believe whatever I wanted to without any sort of basis in the Bible, I'd be a Mormon, because Mormon eschatology is fantastic. You die and you can have as many wives as you want, and then you become a god and you get your own planet and you still get to have kids and do everything fun about that. And then you're the god of the planet. It's like, if you're going to make up a system and believe whatever you want, that's the one to go for. As long as you don't have to have any basis in fact or truth, go do that. But that's optimistic to me. realistic is to say this is what the Bible says, and we're going to believe that.
And I always like to throw it, right back at them. It's like, how can you say Jesus Christ the King coming back, ushering in God's kingdom, defeating Satan, defeating the powers of that of this world that are against him? How in the world is that optimistic or pessimistic? Like, it just doesn't make any sense to me. And it's like, what's better, the kingdom
Yeah.
of Christ without Christ, or the kingdom of Christ because of Christ? Because why is it the kingdom of Christ? Because
Oh,
Christ
that's
is the
good.
king. And they just want the kingdom without the king, and say, oh, this is how optimistic it is. I'm like, I just don't see it. And I don't think that they, for them it's good. For them the argument works. But as far as convincing and trying to project their theology onto us, I don't think that they thought too much of that through. What would you say for the person who argues from a pan-millennialist point of view that will all just pan out in the end? Why would you say that this theology debate discussion, whatever kind of title we want to put in it, like, why does this matter?
Well, I understand that view, and there's a lot of things that you can be that way about. So why does it matter, and why should you not be a pan-millennialist? I really would have to say you're not devoting enough time to what the Word of God says if you don't care. So, for example, I think it's 2 Timothy 4:8. Paul actually promises that the people who love the Lord's appearing will be blessed, and they'll receive a crown. And so that implies to us, at least implies to us, that we should be not only concerned with our eschatological view, but that we should love it. We should not bicker and argue over which one is right and wrong per se, but be willing to say, I want to study this and try to figure out what's true and what's right, and devote my time and my effort to figuring out what I should look forward to or what I should be preparing for. It's a lot different. I'll admit this. If you're a post-millennialist and you believe that the world is going to go on for another 100,000 years, and you're looking at that kind of a time span, you do need to act differently than you would if you believe that the world is going to end in the next 7 years. You're going to have to act differently, and your evangelistic endeavors are going to be different. You're going to be able to take a long-term approach to evangelism as opposed to a more blunt and forward approach. Not to say that either one of those is better or worse. It's just to say you're going to have to take different approaches. And so it weighs in. Your eschatology is going to play into what kind of evangelism you want to have a part of, what you're willing to swallow and what you're willing not to. A post-millennialist with a view that long into history may be very protective of doctrine to the point where they're not allowing somebody into their church that is a continuationist when they're a cessationist. That is, they believe in sign gifts like speaking in tongues or healing. A person with that long of a view may not be willing to accept those things because they're looking at the long view and saying, if I accept that now, in 20,000 years, where are we going to be? Whereas if you believe the world's going to end in 7, if you've got people in your church that believe in speaking in tongues and you don't, you might be willing to work with them because you think, well, it may not matter. The world's going to wrap up here soon. So yeah, I think that would be a big part of it is who are you willing to work with? What difference is it going to make on your evangelistic endeavors? How are you going to act differently? All of that matters. And if you're just going to sit back and say, well, I'll just figure it out when it gets here, it's like saying, I'll put my seatbelt on if I get in a crash. You're going to need to know ahead of time. You probably need to have that figured out.
Yep, amen. Absolutely. Well, thank you, for joining us, Dr. Michael, Shultz, and being here and spending time with us. I hope you guys like this, talk. And if you can help Method Ministries by subscribing and liking and sharing, that'd be great. And until next time, enjoy the rest of your day, guys. Take care.